Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to join our Neureport this week. And thanks Naoren Yan for inviting us. Dr. Dennis Van der Zever is currently an associate professor and principal investigator at the Institute of Science and Technology for Brain-Inspired Intelligence at Fudan University. He got his postdoc training at University of York. Sorry, Dennis. He got his postdoc training at the University of York, United Kingdom, and received his PhD from the United of Cambridge. Dennis is leading the Brain-Inspired Intelligence and Adaptive Systems Laboratory at ISTBI. His long-term research goal is to unravel the brain-based mechanisms of cognitive and behavioral alternatism, alternativity, and to apply brain-inspired intelligence to the development of future generation of the adaptable system. Today, he will bring us a talk on navigating mental spaces. Very interesting topic. Welcome, Dennis.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that introduction, Xiao. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me to give this talk today. And for some of you, I know that it's quite late in the evening. So thank you very much for joining in. So as Xiao said, I'm based in Shanghai at Fudan University at ISTBI. And the current work that I'll be talking about is related to the navigation of mental spaces. So the general outline of the talk today will be first talking about this navigation and the grid-like representation and navigation in animals, in rodents. And then we'll move on to grid-like representation and navigation in humans, providing some information about recent work coming up in this area, both in the context of spatial navigation and non-spatial navigation. And then we will dive into the default mode network, which is the main area that I study, to explore some novel perspectives on its contribution to human cognition. Right, so let's begin. Right. So first, I would like to start out by talking about cognitive maps, which will be the central theme across this talk. And the first person to coin the cognitive map term was actually Edward Tolman, who was an incredible behavioral scientist who studied spatial navigation in rodents. So in his experimental work, he mainly employed intricate designs of mazes, like the one you see on the right-hand side, while recording the ability of mice to learn locations of various rewards. Across the studies, though, an interesting observation that he made was that after unrewarded exposure to mazes, rats still learn certain characteristics of their environment. So, for example, they would take shortcuts to reach the rewards, or they would find new routes when old ones were blocked. So this suggested that the memories formed in the spatial maze were not just mere reflections of the animal's experience, but rather they appear to encode particular relations between locations that were never directly experienced before. So these transitive relations informed, he thought, the animal's decision on which routes to take when newly opened paths afforded shortcuts. Based on this, Tolman hypothesized that the animals had formed a cognitive map of the environment during encoding, a mental representation of the relative locations of objects and boundaries in their environment. Although initially he envisaged this cognitive map to be a domain general representation and made some speculations on its contribution to a variety of psychological domains, most of the ensuing work actually focused on spatial navigation, right? But it wasn't until about 20 years later that a putative physiological signature of this theoretical cognitive map was found. In their work, O'Keefe and colleagues have identified particular hippocampal cells that selectively responded when the animal moved through specific locations in the environment. So just to demonstrate this a bit better, I will play this video, which I hope you will hear the sound. So what you will hear is the direct recording of the firing pattern of a hippocampal neuron that largely respond when the animal is moving through a particular location within the maze. So in other words, the neurons firing field. Okay. All right, I'll stop it there. So due to their place selectivity, these cells were actually called place cells. And it's absolutely beautiful the way that these videos are made. Again, as you can tell, these are direct recordings of firing patterns of the hippocampal neurons when the animal is moving through a particular location, especially within this location to which the neuron is firing. Adding to this work, in about 2005, another neuronal code was identified by Edward and Maybrit Moser, which they termed grid cells. So in contrast to the place cells, instead of firing at a specific location within the environment, grid cells in the entorhinal cortex exhibit this beautiful pattern of hexagonal firing that tile the entire floor of the environment that the animal is actually located in. So again, we'll play the video. I might actually fast forward a little bit here. Instead of sound, you will actually see the dots that represent the firing patterns. So as the animal explores this environment, let's fast forward a little bit. This very beautiful tiling emergence. Yeah. Okay, so this means that there is a six-fold symmetry to the firing pattern because it's a hexagonal shape, which will become an important aspect of some of the work that I'll be discussing a bit later on. Yeah. Based on the seminal work, place and grid cells were suggested to code the animal's location and distance from its surroundings in order to help with the spatial navigation. And they're even postulated to contribute to computations of path integration and vector navigation at the same time. These incredible findings were, of course, recognized by the Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine in 2014. As such, spatial navigation and its representation in the hippocampal-entorhinal system has attracted much attention in the past few decades, and further characteristics of this navigational system has been identified, including kind of head direction cells, border cells, etc., which I don't have time to go into, but in general, altogether, the takeaway message is that there's a spatial navigation system specifically within the entorhinal and hippocampal cortex that helps the animal navigate its environment. Yeah. But the question then becomes, given that most of our research is based on fMRI work with humans, what about humans? Do they also exhibit a similar navigational system? Unfortunately, it's difficult to carry out such invasive procedures for direct recordings in the hippocampal-entorhinal cortex in humans. But in the past couple of years, a wealth of information has accumulated on the presence of this navigational system also in the human medial temporal lobe, right? And to this end, the most important work came out around 2010 with Dollar and colleagues using non-invasive fMRI technology. So at first, they've carried out an animal study with direct recordings from the entorhinal cortex. They show that the preferred firing directions of directionally modulated grid cells in rat entorhinal cortex are aligned with the grids, and that the spatial organization of grid cell firing is more strongly apparent at faster than slower running speeds. And then what they did was to actually design a human version of this experiment for which they created a virtual reality environment that mimicked the rat's foraging task. So these are very similar to kind of Morris water mazes. You have a circular arena in which the participant is allowed to roam quite freely, but they also have particular rewards in particular locations that the participant has to navigate and kind of catch the rewards. Let's say if it's an apple, they have to kind of move towards that apple and catch that apple, right? And they utilized three different aspects of the grid cell representation in order to find signatures of this grid cell firing pattern using fMRI. One of them is the fact that these grid cells have a six-fold symmetry, as I mentioned earlier, meaning that they should show greater activity at every 60 degrees, starting from zero, or a mean grid orientation. The second piece of evidence is that if they're comparing the running phases of the participant along the grid versus off the grid, and then they should again see greater activity in the entorhinal cortex. And the third piece of evidence is that if they're running faster, just like they've found in the animal studies, that there should be greater activity observed in the entorhinal cortex than if they're running at slower speeds. And this is actually exactly what they observed with this fMRI experiment. First of all, they could find 60 degrees periodicity in the entorhinal cortex, specifically on the right entorhinal cortex. But also they compared it to some other folds like four-fold or eight-fold navigation, which didn't show the same pattern. And also compared the aligned versus the misaligned navigation within this maze, which again showed greater activity for the navigation that was aligned with the grid representation. The interesting bit here was that in addition to the entorhinal cortex, when they actually did a whole brain analysis, there were some other regions such as the medial prefrontal cortex, the posterior parietal cortex, that also showed greater activity, and also this six-fold symmetry in addition to the entorhinal cortex. Moreover, the coherence of the potential grid orientations in each participant's right entorhinal cortex was significantly correlated with that participant's spatial memory performance. So in general, they were basically the first ones to kind of open up this new area in which we can actually identify grid-like representations using fMRI technology in humans. But obviously, the biggest worry that we always have in any kind of fMRI work is that we're indirectly kind of measuring brain activity based on BOLT, the blood oxygenation. So the evidence that was lacking is that actually we can directly observe these signatures in humans, recordings from neuronal activity. So the evidence for that came out in 2013 by Jacobs and colleagues, in which they also asked participants to perform a virtual navigation task. But this time, these were patients, neurosurgical patients, that they could actually record directly from the entorhinal cortex. And the direct recordings from these patients revealed cells exhibiting very similar grid-like spiking patterns that we observe in fMRI signatures as well in the entorhinal cortex, but also in the cingulate cortices as well, just like Dollar and colleagues have found. So this in general suggested that humans and other animals rely on homologous spatial coding schemes that might be utilized for spatial navigation. And not only direct navigation, but there was actually another piece of evidence that came out in 2016, where Horner and colleagues have asked participants to imagine themselves navigating in this virtual environment. And very similarly, they could find the same six-fold symmetry while the participants navigated this environment, which showed greater activity during movement as opposed to stationary conditions, but also in comparison to the control conditions, which have four-fold or an eight-fold rotational symmetry. So this, in general, the authors have suggested that the grid cells might be utilized during movement of viewpoint within imagery, and they might potentially underpin our more general ability to mentally traverse possible routes in the service of planning, right? But how about beyond spatial navigation? As we discussed before, Tolman actually envisaged this cognitive map as being a domain general map and not just for spatial navigation, but obviously he was studying animals, so it's a bit more difficult to find other evidence from other domains. But in humans, especially utilizing this grid-like signature, we might be able to look at other domains as well. So a good paper that came out related to this was actually in 2016, which was published in Science, in which Constantinescu and colleagues actually generated a very abstract map, a very abstract environment that doesn't rely on spatial navigation. And for that, what they utilized was this duck, as you can see. And the space was defined by the length of the neck and the length of the legs of the duck, which was morphing at particular speeds, so that the combination of them made up movement along a particular angle within a 2D dimension, right? And what they did initially was to make participants learn this space across a variety of different behavioral experiments. And this 2D space was also associated with particular rewards in particular locations, again, to make sure that the participants actually learn this space. Interestingly, though, none of them actually had an explicit knowledge that this made up a 2D space. But when they looked at the results while the participants were actually navigating this 2D space, again, they show greater activity in the entorhinal cortex, which followed a six-fold symmetry. But also other regions that make up the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, as well as the posterior cingulate cortex. So this in general opened up a new area in which we can actually assess other domains in which this spatial navigation system might be useful. So not just for spatial navigation. And in fact, a couple of more papers are emerging recently in which authors are suggesting that the same navigational system might be utilized for conceptual knowledge space, or even social spaces in which participants learn the relationships or particular attributes of people, and they can even infer based on this information what the attributes of a particular person is in that two-dimensional space. So the point to make here again is that this 3D navigational system in a two-dimensional space might be utilized beyond spatial navigation, right? So to summarize what we know so far is that the spatial neural codes can be identified in humans using functional MRI, and the spatial neural codes may encode and navigate relational, non-spatial and abstract cognitive spaces. And spatial neural codes may be used to infer positions on a 2D quality or state space and generalize to new situations and to efficiently guide decision-making of the participants. So the two things that we should recognize here is that one of them is the abstraction of this relational memory that goes beyond a physical environmental space, but also the efficiency in which this space might be utilized for making inferences and generalization at the same time. Right? And another thing to recognize, which hasn't been talked about much in the literature, is the fact that it's not just the entorhinal cortex, but a lot of these experiments, both the abstract navigation and the spatial navigation, actually show the same six-fold symmetrical pattern in the medial prefrontal and posterior parietal cortices, like the posterior cingulate cortex, and as well as the angular gyri as well. In the literature, the collection of these regions are actually known as the default mode network, which has been associated with a variety of different functions, including thinking about autobiographical memories or planning for the future, which might be related to some of the navigational problems that we talked about earlier. So in the next bit of the talk, I will actually move on to the default mode network and kind of explore this idea as to how there might be a connection between this mental navigation and the default mode network brain system. All right. So to begin with, I will kind of give a historical background on the default mode network, because some of you might not be too familiar. So the story of the default mode actually dates back to the early stages of PET and fMRI scanning and is used for cognitive neuroscience research. In addition to cognitive tasks that the researchers are commonly interested in, they also collected data at rest. So as you can see here, in a very simple block design, they might ask participants to move their fingers, and they might also have particular rest periods. This is mainly because for certain perceptual tasks, such as when a light appeared in the screen, they didn't necessarily know what a control condition would be. So instead, they used these rest periods as basically the control conditions. The interesting bit was that across a variety of different tasks, the task contrast, when you're comparing the active condition to the rest condition, they showed expected activations in the corresponding brain regions, such as if it was a motor task, it would be greater activity in the motor cortex. If it was a visual task, it would be greater activity in the visual cortex. But when they compared them, the reverse compared them, so what is more active in the rest period than it is in the active task period, they actually realized that there was a common selection of brain regions that showed greater activity during these rest periods. So these kind of encompass regions such as the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, the posterior parietal cortex, like the posterior cingulate cortex, the bilateral angular gyri, and a lot of the medial temporal lobe regions as well. This was rather surprising, as they didn't know how to characterize such deactivations, both from a physiological and also cognitive perspective. But further research into the subject revealed that the same regions also showed highest metabolic activity at rest, suggesting that there was a set of brain regions with high levels of ongoing activity with contributions to brain processes from which we tend to deviate when we perform particular experimental tasks. So based on this evidence, Professor Reichel called this the default mode of brain function. In addition, around the same time, another data analysis technique called functional connectivity has been introduced, in which instead of relative activations or deactivations in a particular task, what we ask participants to do is to simply rest inside the scanner. And here, instead of activity, we're actually looking at how the fluctuations in activity are actually correlated across different brain regions. Using a method which we now call resting state and functional connectivity, Gracians and colleagues in 2003 have shown that the default mode regions were also functionally connected in the absence of a task condition, paving the way for the default mode regions to be recognized as a particular network, right? And this reiterated something very important in cognitive neuroscience research, because most of the time when we scan participants while they perform a particular task, specifically perceptual tasks, we assume that certain brain regions light up that are only relevant to that particular task at hand. And this represents a bit more kind of like a serial system. However, the findings that I just presented point that the brain operates in a more proactive and ongoing manner, and that the additional resources required for processing incoming information is only a fraction of the overall ongoing brain function. And using this method, other resting state brain networks have been identified. So default mode is not the only resting state brain network, but the whole brain can actually be compartmentalized into particular functional brain networks, such as the visual network or the somatomotor network, or more kind of higher level cognitive networks, such as the frontoparietal control network or the dorsal attention network. When it comes to some of the more perceptual networks, or even the ones that have been associated with particular tasks before, such as the dorsal attention network, we kind of have a general understanding of what these networks do or how do they contribute to cognition. The problem is that the default mode network was never identified before as a system, hence why it was very difficult, and it still is difficult, to actually know how it contributes to human cognition. But there is some interesting facts about it. So first, we will talk about default mode physiology. The interesting bit is that the default mode brain regions show very high structural and functional connectivity, meaning that they're very highly interconnected. And in fact, more from a graph theoretical perspective, they show this cortical hub structure, meaning that they are the main highways within the brain that might facilitate the connection across various different brain regions. In addition to that, there is some interesting kind of anti-correlations, so regions that show a reduction in activity while the activity in the default mode network goes up. And these tend to kind of encompass regions that are commonly associated with attention-driven external mentation. So this kind of gave rise to this idea that the default mode network is a task negative network, in the sense that it doesn't contribute to any kind of ongoing cognition during task performance, but is more about internal mentation that is not associated with the current environment. However, that doesn't really fit with some of the other evidence that are currently emerging. So one of the important bits that we should highlight is that the same default mode regions actually are implicated in a variety of different mental health disorders, including neurodegenerative disorders. So Alzheimer's disease, for instance, there's a lot of evidence now suggesting that the tauopathy generally starts from regions that are implicated in the default mode network and kind of spreads from there. Similarly, it's been associated with changes in Parkinson's disease, but also more kind of neuropsychiatric and neurodevelopmental disorders as well. So taken together, this kind of makes the point that default mode must be important or doing something very core in which it contributes to human cognition. When it comes to the hypotheses related to what it actually does, as I said earlier, there's actually a variety of different active task conditions in which we see greater default mode network activity. So some of these are related to autobiographical memory retrieval or thinking about the future, or a bit more kind of social cognition, such as theory of mind or moral decision making. So taken together, one of the earlier hypotheses related to the default mode network contribution to cognition was about internal mentation. So things that are self-referential and related, but more focused internally as opposed to dealing with external task demands. But again, I don't think this, although this is a very important contribution of the default mode, I don't think this really encompasses what the default mode might be doing, mainly because we have this additional evidence suggesting that default mode network is also highly connected and present in other animals as well, such as in rats or in monkey brains. And unless we can make the kind of claim that other animals are also going through the self-referential internal mentation, I think a more plausible hypothesis is that the default mode might be doing something core that actually transcends across different animal species, right? So the question becomes, which is what I've been working on for the past 8 years or more, is how does the default mode network contribute to animal cognition? And there is a wealth of information now, and I think by today, there's more than 6,000-7,000 publications on the default mode network that cover task-driven papers or disease states or functional connectivity, but there is still no consensus on what the cognitive role of the default mode network actually is and how it actually contributes to healthy and adaptive brain function. And I think part of the problem actually comes from this kind of almost human-centric romanticism of its potential role in cognition, but at the same time, to a certain level, it comes from the way in which we actually conduct cognitive neuroscience research. So the most common approach is to design, based on a particular cognitive function that we're interested in, is to design an experiment or a task that we think is measuring that particular cognitive function. And then we put participants inside the scanner and then say, aha, I found the region of the brain that is associated with creativity, let's say. The problem with this approach has been highlighted by both Friston and Kathy Price and Paul Jark as well recently, suggesting that this is a very problematic reverse inference problem, mainly because the same brain regions actually are associated with a variety of different cognitive processes that we can test inside the fMRI scanner. So what I suggest, instead of focusing on these different cognitive functions, is that we should actually take more of a process approach as opposed to a function approach when trying to deduce what the system level brain networks actually do. And what I mean by that is that you can think about For instance, how a pharmaceutical company operates. So they would have different divisions that actually do particular jobs. So let's say the human resources, the drug discovery, the marketing, etc., etc. So all of these different divisions represent particular functions. However, the process in this particular example would be, how do we take a new drug into the market, right? So for that to happen, we have to take this kind of horizontal approach, which is more process oriented as opposed to particular function oriented, right? But when we do this, when we look at the variety of different functions that the default mode network has been associated before, such as autobiographical memory retrieval, semantic memory, episodic memory, reinforcement learning, internal mentation, decision making, etc., etc. I think two main kind of processes actually emerge, and one of them is the abstraction of knowledge, so storage of knowledge in an abstract form, which we call memory, and also the use of this information, this memory, for more efficient inference and generalization to be able to deal with novel situations. And these two processes are actually very much related to the processes that we've discussed before in the context of mental navigation. And given the spatial overlap between some of the results that came out from the mental navigation work and some of the results that we observed within the default mode network work, what the suggestion that I have is that a very core process that the default mode might be involved in is in this domain general mental navigation. So the next bit will be focusing on these two aspects of this process, the abstraction and the automation, and I'll try to give some examples from our work as well, right? So the first bit is about abstraction. So there is some interesting work that has come out recently, which suggests that the default mode actually lies at the peak of this hierarchical organization of functional interactions in the brain, which is furthest away from more perceptual or motor regions of the brain. And if we actually look at along this dimension, what are some cognitive processes that have been associated with this gradient, is that at the very kind of perceptual motor end, obviously we have more motor or visual perception functions, whereas on the other side, the side that is related more to the default mode network, we then have more cognitive functions that are associated with memory and also abstracted knowledge, such as autobiographical memory retrieval or verbal semantics, emotions, and social cognition. So this in general is interpreted as the default mode might be representing the end of a gradient in which knowledge or information is quite abstracted away from perceptual information. And another piece of information that came out related to this is actually that the default mode regions show the greatest evolutionary expansion when comparing macaque monkeys and going to the human brain. And this might be underlying our kind of expanded ability to hold more abstracted information in mind. And we have this amazing kind of skill to be able to store information in long-term memory in service of decision-making, but also kind of interpreting our environments. And this, in general, has been kind of conceptualized by Tolman back in 1970s. And it is our declarative memory, so our kind of long-term memory has generally been associated with two different divisions. One of them is more kind of factual information, which we call semantic memory, and another one is called episodic memory, which is more about our autobiographical experiences. So for instance, when I tell you B or show you a picture of B, you might have some particular factual information about its color, its shape, and the fact that it produces honey and may potentially sting. But more on the episodic side, you may recall that you were stung by a bee when you went out for a picnic with your family last summer, let's say. And together, this information is thought to make up our long-term memory stores. And since this classical distinction, the main goal of cognitive and clinical neurosciences have been to better understand neural mechanism behind these two functionally distinct memory systems, which again has been suggested to represent this abstracted long-term knowledge that we carry, right? For example, when it comes to the semantic memory, an influential hub and spoke model have been devised for semantic memory specifically. We suggest that the anterior temporal lobe might be an A-modal hub that encodes general semantic concepts that selectively interact with more modal-specific regions in the brain. Conversely, this hub has been contrasted with another hub centered on the posterior parietal regions, and that plays a general role in the retrieval of more contextually rich information that is related to episodic memory. So based on this information, these two memory systems have always been studied in isolation and not matched for particular strength of information that they might actually carry. So when we look at the literature a bit more closely, the connection that I'm going to make is that actually one can recognize that the memory strength manipulations are a common feature of most semantic memory paradigms, but such memory manipulations are not generally utilized in episodic memory. And when we look at the spatial maps associated with these different tasks, yes, we can see that the general semantic network includes more regions that are associated with kind of cognitive control, but actually there is a lot of spatial overlap with the default mode network regions as well, which we said has been associated with this level of abstraction from a navigation perspective, but also from a memory, episodic and semantic memory perspective as well. So together, this evidence gives rise to two alternative hypotheses on memory organization in the human brain. One, which is the status quo that suggests that the semantic and episodic memory are spatially distinct, and there are two different memory systems. But actually, when we think about it more from a navigation perspective and how information, this memory, long-term memory storage might be related to the abstraction, then the alternative hypothesis is that they might be relying on a common neural mechanism, but the differentiating factor might be how strong that memory actually is, and how abstracted that memory actually is, right? So in order to test these alternative hypotheses, what we had to do was to devise a multi-session MRI experiment in which the same participants were assessed for their semantic and episodic memory retrieval abilities at the same time. Importantly here, though, we introduced the memory strength manipulation for both memory systems that could specifically test our hypotheses on how much cognitive control demands may explain the traditionally observed differences between the two memory systems. So for that purpose, the participants first attended an fMRI session in which they were asked to select a target word that was most conceptually associated with a probe amongst two other alternatives. So for instance, if the participants were shown B, the correct answer in this instance would be sting. But in addition to that, they had some weak association trials as well, in which if the target was chair, the correct answer in this instance would be swing, right? Subsequently, the participants attended an episodic memory task in which they actually were trained in encoding two conceptually unrelated words, such as apple and flute or castle and soap. And in this instance, the level of strength of this association or abstraction of these connections or of these relationships was based on how much they actually were trained. So for the strong condition, they were trained 6 times, whereas for the weak condition, they were trained twice. So finally, the participants came back for a second MRI session in which they were asked to recall the target that they previously learned with paradigm characteristics that generally match those that were employed in the episodic task as well. So at first, our aim was to directly compare and contrast the retrieval of semantic and episodic memory within these participants. And the results kind of generally matched what was previously observed in the literature, in that while greater activity was observed on the left inferior frontal gyrus within semantic as compared to episodic memory, we see greater activity in the posterior cingulate cortices and the bilateral angular gyri when we compare episodic versus semantic memory. And this kind of fits with the findings from the literature as well. This is a very quick meta-analysis based on the Neuroscientific database. Again, when we subtract episodic memory from semantic memory, we see greater regions associated with cognitive control, whereas when we contrast episodic versus semantic, we see greater regions associated with the posterior cingulate and the bilateral angular gyri. The interesting bit, however, is that has happened when we compare the effective memory strength, thus cognitive control demands on these memory retrieval networks, right? So here, what we're doing is looking at the weak versus strong trials, as I explained earlier, both in the semantic memory context and the episodic memory context as well. What this has revealed is greater left lateralized activity in the retrieval of weak as opposed to strong memory traces across the two memory types, which you can kind of observe, sorry, it's a bit small in these kind of memory specific instances, but you can also look at the conjunction of these control systems as well. And the level of activity in this region was associated with the performance of the participants within this task, right? Even more interestingly, though, in the context of more kind of greater abstraction or greater strength of memory is when we do the reverse contrast. So when we're looking for what is more active in the brain while the participants are retrieving strong semantic memories and strong episodic memories. And in this context, the automatic retrieval of strong memory traces show convergence on the posterior parietal regions, such as the posterior cingulate cortex, as well as the bilateral angular gyri, but a bit more kind of focused on the right angular gyrus. Together, these regions partly form what we call, what I introduced earlier, as the default mode network, again, making the point that these more abstracted or strong relationships that we've formed about objects, either in a conceptual sense or a contextual sense, are engaging more the default mode regions in the brain, right? And the last piece of evidence related to this was that actually these two systems that has been associated with strong relationships versus weak relationships have to be separated from each other for the participants to actually perform better. So less interaction between regions of the cognitive control network with regions of the default mode network was actually associated with better performance. So putting this together, what we're suggesting based on this work is that there might be a common neural mechanism in the retrieval of both semantic and episodic memory, which is very abstracted knowledge that we can declare as humans. And one important kind of aspect to recognize is how much overlap there is between these two systems, specifically within the retrieval of information. We don't necessarily know yet in terms of how this is related to actual representation, but definitely in the context of retrieval, the default mode network plays a common role across both semantic and episodic memory. So together, again, this is related to abstraction, which I think is one of the important aspects that has been discussed in the context of navigation of mental spaces, in which abstracted relational knowledge is necessary to navigate our environments or conceptual information. And that memory strength, how strong these relationships are that we have about these internal models actually makes a huge difference in terms of how much the default mode network will actually be engaged, right? So the second kind of process that I want to mention in this context is actually about automation. So automation is something that hasn't been discussed so much in the cognitive neuroscience literature, and most of the time it's been associated with this kind of unconscious type of processing. But what I mean by automation is actually the efficient use of this memory-guided information for us to be able to make decisions about the demands of the environment, right? And there is some interesting evidence related to this in the context of the Tolman network. So for instance, some earlier work from Moshe Bar in 2007 suggests that particular objects and in the environment that are associated with a very kind of strong context, such as a roulette table associated with a casino, actually generate greater activity centered on the Tolman network. Right? Again, this relates to a level of abstraction that we discussed earlier, but at the same time, it suggests that even before we kind of observe particular objects or observe particular contexts, there's a prior internal model of what the brain expects to see in that particular context. And this is generally associated with the Tolman network activity. But there's also great studies that have been conducted more in the context of expertise, in which both visual spatial training and reasoning-based training, greater expertise was associated with, again, a switch more from this control type of cognition to more automated cognition, which again was related to the Tolman network interactions. Right? So this might be, again, navigating this particular space efficiently in the context of making decisions, but also in the context of kind of anticipating or inferring what might be required by the environment in the future. So in order to test this a bit more closely, we actually utilized a cognitive flexibility task, which is called the Wisconsin card sorting task. So cognitive flexibility is a very commonly studied function within cognitive neurosciences, which kind of relates to our ability to be able to switch from a particular course of action to another course of action that better meets environmental demands. The important bit is that cognitive flexibility is an important aspect of our cognition, but at the same time, it requires a level of cognitive stability. So our ability to kind of follow a course of action while ignoring particular distractors in the environment. And this is not studied as much as cognitive flexibility. So the idea here was we were trying to combine these two different aspects, one cognitive flexibility and one cognitive stability in the same kind of experimental condition. So in order to do this, we devised the task in a way that is quite similar to the original Wisconsin card sorting task, but with some paradigm manipulations. So just to give you a quick introduction, the reference card up here never change. So the participants always see the same card. What changes is the target card in the middle of the screen. And all that the participants have to do is to match that target card with one of the reference cards based on particular rules that they have to learn from trial and error with the environment, right? So these task rules actually change every 10 trials, and they cover things like color. So if the rule is color, they have to match it with this card. If the rule is shape, they have to match it with this card. And if the rule is number, they have to match it with this card. We also have a control condition in which the card is exactly the same as one of the reference cards. So that doesn't require any kind of rule-based decision-making, but it's a lot more perceptual matching of information. So as I said, we had 10 different trials that the participants had to do within a given task rule. And after that, the task rule changed. So what the participants have to do across these 10 trials is first learn what the rule is based on feedback and trial and error, which the first 5 trials we called the acquisition or the learning phase of the task. And once they learned the task, what they had to do was to actually apply the same rule, this kind of abstract cognitive rule, into sorting out the cards as they were instructed to do. And this next 5 trials, we called it the application phase of the task. What we were expecting is related to what I discussed earlier, is that once the participants had a very good idea of this abstracted rule about their environment, about the task, and they were just simply applying this in an automated fashion, that we would observe greater activity in the application phase as opposed to the acquisition phase. Whereas the acquisition phase would be more associated with this control type of cognition or ability to switch from a previous rule that the participants were following. Right, these are just some behavioral results that for now, for the sake of time, I will skip. But the more interesting bit is actually the brain results, in which, as I mentioned earlier, when we look at the learning phase as compared to the application phase, we generally see regions of the brain that are more active in a variety of different control or attention demanding tasks, such as the frontal eye fields or the inferior parietal sulcus, but also the inferior frontal gyrus as well, again, has been associated with kind of cognitive control and execution. However, the interesting bit is that when we look at the reverse contrast, so what is more active when the participants are applying the learned rule to deal with the environment, as opposed to learning that new rule, and what we see is greater activity in the default mode network regions, such as the posterior cingulate cortex and the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, right? Interestingly, then is looking at the interaction of these two different systems. So one more associated with kind of the automated use of information to deal with the environment, versus another one about learning new relationships within the environment. We see interesting changes in their interactions, mainly their anti-correlation actually increase when the participants learn what the rule is and they have to apply this. But a more direct evidence into the involvement of the default mode network in this automated type of cognition comes from the behavioral relationships. So here we try to do kind of like a double dissociation, in which the dorsal attention network, so we had to select a particular region of interest to focus in this analysis. But in general, the dorsal attention network was associated with better performance, but only in the acquisition phase of the task and not in the application phase. Whereas more for the default mode network, the interaction between a core hub, such as the posterior cingulate cortex, with the entorhinal cortex was associated with better performance, but only in the application phase and not in the acquisition, the learning phase of the task. So in general, what this suggests to us is that the default mode network shows greater activity in the application of abstracted learned rules in comparison with rule acquisition or learning of information. And that the connectivity of the default mode with the medial temporal lobe regions, specifically more with the entorhinal cortex, was related to faster reaction times. So in general, when we put this together, our interpretation was that the default mode might be associated with this automated, efficient use of information to deal with the environment. And there's also a number of different studies that mention the default mode network from this perspective. So as I mentioned earlier, very strong contextual associations about the environment and what we expect to see in particular environments, more from a kind of object recognition or scene recognition perspective, again, has been associated with the default mode network. But also there's a lot of reward related work as well, which suggests with greater link between a cue and a reward is associated with greater default mode network activity, but also more kind of in the context of social cognition, such as stereotypes or prejudices that we strongly hold, again, are associated with regions of the default mode network. So putting this information together more from a navigational perspective, the hypothesis that we're currently working on is that the superordinate process in which the default mode network might be playing a key role is the automated navigation of this abstract relational information that we learn through our lifetime, in order to be able to rapidly and efficiently predict and respond to environmental demands. So very kind of the reason why I kind of call this autopilot is because of, again, in the context of navigation, I think it nicely provides a good analogy as to how the default mode might be contributing to not only human, but also other animal cognition as well. But why is this important? This is a question that I get in a lot of the talks. Obviously, it's important from the perspective of it's important to understand how the brain actually works and how it contributes to cognition, but it also has a lot of clinical implications as well. So as I mentioned earlier, the default mode regions is where a lot of tauopathies actually start and propagate from, specifically when it comes to Alzheimer's disease. But there's also recent work suggesting that people who are at risk of Alzheimer's based on their genetic makeup show greater activity in their entorhinal cortex for this grid-like representation that we discussed earlier. So there might be a connection in terms of this kind of mental navigation, its relationship with spatial navigation, non-spatial navigation, and the default mode network that might act as a particular biomarker in the future and try to explain some of the observations we have about deficits in these neurodegenerative disorders. Right, so putting this all together, what we discussed was mental navigation, both in a spatial context and a non-spatial context, and the fact that some of the findings relate to the default mode network. And in fact, from a default mode network perspective, we actually see this network's contribution to human cognition within the context of abstraction and automation, which are very important processes that are also implicated within mental navigation as well, to be able to predict, infer, and generalize about our environments. So before I finish, I should thank my collaborators and people that we've done this work with. So a lot of the cognitive flexibility work is based on our collaborations at the University of Cambridge during my postdoctoral work. And a lot of the semantic episodic work that I mentioned earlier is related to my postdoc position at the University of York, right? And currently, we have an amazing team here. As Xiao said, the Brain-Inspired Intelligence and Adaptive Systems Lab, in which we're further exploring some of this mental navigation explanation of the default mode contribution to human cognition across a variety of different experimental settings. Right, so that's all I have for today. And now I'm happy to kind of take your questions.